The Boy in the Window. The morning sunlight streamed through the glass walls of Crestview Children's Hospital, washing the marble floors in pale gold. The automatic doors sighed open again and again as parents hurried in with flowers, doctors moved in crisp white coats, and nurses pushed metal carts that clicked softly down the corridor. Among all the noise and color, one corner of the rehabilitation wing stayed strangely silent. There, beside a wide window that overlooked the garden courtyard, sat a boy in a wheelchair. He was 16 but looked younger because of the thinness of his frame and the way his shoulders slumped forward. His hands rested motionless on the blanket that covered his legs, and his gaze was fixed somewhere far beyond the glass. His name was Ethan Raymond, only son of Victor Raymond, a man whose wealth built half the skyscrapers in the city. Yet here, in this hospital, money meant nothing. No donation could buy back the use of Ethan's legs. Ethan had been in that chair for 9 months since the accident that broke his spine and changed everything. Once, he had been the star of his school's soccer team, loud and full of jokes. The kind of boy who ran instead of walked and laughed instead of talked. Now he sat still, his laughter buried under layers of silence. The nurses treated him kindly, but most of the patients avoided him. They whispered about him instead, about how his father could afford any treatment in the world, about how he must think he was better than everyone else. Some said he was cold, others said he was proud. None of them knew that Ethan barely slept at night, that every sound of footsteps reminded him of the accident, that every morning he woke hoping to feel something below his knees and felt nothing at all. On the day everything began to change, the rehabilitation wing was busier than usual. A group of teenagers from the volunteer club of Ridgewood High had come to entertain the younger patients, singing, playing guitar, painting faces. Their laughter echoed through the hallways, bringing a kind of sunshine that hospitals rarely knew. Among them was a tall boy named Ryan, known for his sharp tongue and careless jokes. He was not a bad person, only one who enjoyed attention more than empathy. When he saw Ethan sitting alone near the window, he smirked and whispered something to his friends. They laughed quietly, the way people do when they are afraid of silence. "Must be nice," Ryan murmured loud enough for Ethan to hear. "Sitting there all day, doing nothing, while the world works for you. Rich boy life." His friends chuckled. Ethan did not move, not even his eyes. He had learned long ago that answering cruelty gave it power. The laughter faded, but the bitterness in the air stayed like smoke. What none of them noticed was the little girl standing at the corner of the hallway holding a small stuffed rabbit and staring at Ethan with wide brown eyes. Her name was Lily Hart, 8 years old, a frequent patient in the pediatric wing. She had been born with a fragile heart that needed constant care, yet there was something fierce in her spirit, a brightness that even the tubes and monitors could not dim. Lily watched the older boys walk away and then looked back at Ethan. She had seen him many times before through the glass window that separated their sections. She knew he hardly spoke, that he sat there for hours watching the world outside. But today something in her small chest tightened, the way it did when the doctors talked about pain. She walked closer, dragging her IV pole carefully behind her, the wheels squeaking against the floor. When she reached Ethan's chair, he turned slightly, surprised to see such a tiny visitor. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Lily said softly, "They shouldn't laugh. My mom says laughing at someone's pain makes your own heart smaller." Ethan blinked. No one had defended him in months. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He wanted to tell her thank you, but his throat felt thick, as if it had forgotten how to speak kindness. Lily smiled, as if she could read his silence, and climbed onto the window ledge beside him. "I like this place," she said, pressing her small hand against the glass. "You can see the sky from here. Sometimes I count clouds when my heart hurts." Ethan followed her gaze. The sky outside was wide and blue, with a few slow-moving clouds. "Do you count them too?" she asked. "No," he said finally, his voice rough. "I stopped counting things." "Maybe you should start again," she replied matter-of-factly. "Counting helps. 1, 2, 3, see? The numbers keep you company." It was such a simple idea that Ethan almost laughed. For the first time in months, his lips curved upward slightly. Lily noticed and clapped her hands. "You smiled," she declared triumphantly. "That means you can still do it. My nurse says smiling is like exercise for the heart. Maybe it's exercise for your legs, too, if you do it enough." Her logic was absurd and beautiful at once. Ethan shook his head, but the faint smile stayed. That was how their strange friendship began. A paralyzed millionaire's son and a fragile little girl connected by a window full of clouds. Days passed, and Lily kept coming. Sometimes she brought drawings from her art therapy sessions, clumsy crayon pictures of suns, flowers, and stick figures holding hands. Sometimes she brought stories she made up about the hospital ghosts who fixed broken hearts at night. She talked endlessly. He listened. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Ethan began to speak again. He told her about his dog back home, about his favorite soccer team, about the music he used to play. When he ran out of stories, she filled the silence with her own, until their conversations flowed like a secret river hidden inside the sterile walls. But not everyone saw it that way. Some of the other patients, especially the older volunteers, started whispering again. They said Ethan was pretending to be nice only because the girl made him look good in front of the nurses. One afternoon, Ryan and his friends passed by while Lily was showing Ethan a paper crown she had made. "Look, the prince has found his princess," Ryan joked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe she'll heal him with magic love." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. Lily froze, the paper crown trembling in her hands. Ethan's jaw tightened, anger rose in him like fire. But before he could speak, Lily turned toward the mockers and said calmly, "He doesn't need to be healed. He already helps me every day." Her voice was small but steady, and the laughter faltered. Ryan frowned. "Helps you? How?" "He listens," she said. "He doesn't look away when I talk about dying." The hallway went silent. The words hung in the air heavier than anyone expected. Ethan looked at her in shock. He had never realized how much she carried behind her smiles. Ryan muttered something and left quickly, his face pale. Lily turned back to Ethan and placed the paper crown gently on his head. "See?" she whispered. "You're brave even when you don't move." That night, Ethan could not sleep. He kept hearing her voice. He listens. He remembered the way the laughter stopped when she spoke, the way truth silenced cruelty. For months he had thought he was useless, a burden, someone to be pitied. But to one little girl, he was something more. The thought changed something inside him, small, almost invisible, but real. The next morning, he asked the nurse to bring the physical therapist earlier. It was the first time he had made a request on his own since the accident. Therapy was painful. Muscles that had forgotten movement screamed in protest. Sweat ran down his back as he tried to lift himself with the parallel bars. Each attempt ended in failure, but he did not stop. When the therapist asked what motivated him, Ethan only said, "A promise." He didn't explain that the promise was to a little girl with a paper crown who believed he could be brave. Word of his sudden determination spread through the ward. Some thought it was temporary, another phase of false hope. But Lily believed differently. Every afternoon she sat near the training room, cheering softly when he managed even the smallest motion. 1, 2, 3, she would count, her tiny fingers tapping against her IV pole. "You're doing it, Ethan. The clouds are watching." Weeks blended into months. The seasons outside the window changed from bright summer to red autumn. Lily's health, however, began to decline. The doctors spoke in low voices outside her room. The monitors beeped more often. Ethan noticed, though she tried to hide it. One day she didn't appear by the window, and when he asked, the nurse said she was in intensive care. The world seemed to tilt again. For the first time since his accident, Ethan wheeled himself out of his ward and demanded to see her. The staff hesitated. It wasn't standard procedure, but something in his voice made them step aside. When he entered Lily's room, he saw her lying small and pale against the white sheets, the stuffed rabbit by her side. Tubes and wires surrounded her like a fragile web. Yet when she saw him, she smiled weakly. "You came," she whispered. "I told them you would." Ethan tried to speak, but his throat closed. He rolled his chair closer and took her hand, tiny and cold. "You have to get better," he said finally. "You still owe me cloud counting." She laughed, a sound like wind through paper. "Maybe we can count from different skies," she murmured. "My mom says heaven has the biggest clouds." Tears burned in his eyes, but he held them back because she hated when people cried. "Then I'll build something tall enough to see them," he said, forcing a smile. "A tower so high I can wave at you." She nodded slowly. "Promise?" "Promise." 3 days later, Lily's bed was empty. The nurses had taken away the monitors, the flowers, the rabbit. The hospital felt quieter, emptier. Ethan didn't cry that day or the next. He just sat by the window staring at the sky that suddenly seemed too wide, too blue. But on the 4th day, something inside him broke open, not in despair but in determination. He asked the therapist to double his sessions. He worked until his arms trembled and his hands blistered. When people asked why, he only said, "For Lily," months later. During the hospital's annual charity gala, Victor Raymond stood before donors and staff, announcing a new foundation in memory of a young patient named Lily Hart, a fund to support children with chronic illness who could not afford treatment. He did not know the full story behind his son's insistence on the foundation, only that it was the first time Ethan had spoken passionately about anything since the accident. But everyone in the rehabilitation wing knew. They had seen the boy who never smiled begin to move again, who now wheeled himself through corridors encouraging other patients, telling them, "Even small steps count." And one morning, as the sun rose through the hospital windows, Ethan gripped the bars in the therapy room, sweat dripping from his forehead, and felt, faintly, like the whisper of a dream, the muscles in his right leg respond. He gasped, hardly daring to believe it. The therapist shouted for joy. Somewhere deep inside, he heard Lily's voice counting, 1, 2, 3, and he smiled through his tears. Outside, the sky was full of clouds, drifting slowly toward the horizon, as if carrying a little girl's laughter with them. The promise in the sky, the morning that marked the first twitch of life in Ethan's paralyzed leg, also marked the morning when everything inside him shifted from grief to purpose. The hospital was still quiet when he felt it. That small movement, that flicker of electricity that ran through his nerves like lightning finding its lost path. The therapist had screamed with joy, nurses had rushed in, and even the usually stoic doctor smiled with wet eyes. But amid all the congratulations, Ethan sat still for a moment, his heart beating hard, his thoughts racing toward one face, Lily's. He had promised her he would build something tall enough to reach the clouds, and for the first time it no longer sounded like a dream. It sounded like a beginning. In the days that followed, Ethan's rehabilitation turned from a routine to a mission. The hospital corridors that once felt like a cage now became a training ground. Every morning he wheeled himself to the therapy room before dawn and stayed long after sunset. His father, Victor Raymond, came often, bringing new trainers, expensive equipment, and the best specialists money could find, but Ethan always told them the same thing. He didn't need more money. He needed time, patience, and belief. Victor tried to understand but found it difficult. He had spent his entire life fixing problems with wealth, but this was something money could not command. Watching his son's quiet resolve both humbled and frightened him. The boy he once pitied was becoming someone new, someone he could not control with checks and promises. The doctors called it a miracle when Ethan managed to stand with support 6 months later. The hospital staff gathered that day, clapping as he took his first trembling step between the bars. It was only a few inches, a movement that would mean nothing to most, but to Ethan, it was the entire world unfolding beneath his feet again. And in that moment, he remembered Lily's tiny hand gripping his, her soft voice saying, "You're brave even when you don't move." He whispered her name under his breath and smiled through tears that finally came without shame. For the first time in almost a year, the laughter that had once filled his life returned, quieter, deeper, wiser. As his strength grew, so did his purpose. Ethan began volunteering in the pediatric wing, reading to children whose days were filled with the sterile sounds of machines. He told them stories, not of magic kingdoms or superheroes, but of real courage, of small victories, of counting clouds and finding hope in silence. The nurses watched with awe as the same boy who had once refused to speak now inspired others to fight. Parents thanked him with tears in their eyes. The children adored him, calling him Mr. Cloud Counter. And every time he walked through those halls, he carried Lily's spirit with him like invisible light. But outside the hospital, the world was different. Reporters wanted interviews. News outlets called him the billionaire's son who walked again. Ethan refused them all. He didn't want fame. He wanted meaning. When his father offered to arrange media coverage for positive publicity, Ethan said quietly, "This story isn't about me, Dad. It's about what she taught me." Victor had frowned, unused to hearing his son speak with such conviction. "Who?" he asked. Ethan hesitated, then replied, "Someone who showed me that wealth isn't measured in money." Victor didn't understand then, but those words stayed with him. A year after the accident, Ethan was discharged from Crestview Hospital. The staff lined the halls to say goodbye, cheering as he walked, slowly but unaided, through the automatic doors. The air outside felt new, raw, alive. Cameras flashed in the distance, journalists hoping for a glimpse of the miracle boy, but Ethan ignored them. Instead, he looked up at the sky. The clouds were moving lazily above the city, the same clouds he used to count with Lily. He whispered softly, "We did it." And in the quiet rustle of wind, he could almost hear her laugh. Home, however, was harder than he expected. The Raymond mansion stood like a palace of marble and glass, filled with luxury but empty of warmth. Servants bowed. His father's associates came with congratulations and business cards. Yet at night, when the corridors fell silent and the lights dimmed, Ethan felt the same old emptiness pressing down. He missed the smell of antiseptic, the hum of hospital machines, the chatter of nurses, the place where pain and love had lived side by side. Most of all, he missed Lily's small voice echoing through those sterile halls. He often sat by his bedroom window, staring at the stars, wondering if she was among them, counting with him. One evening, while he was sorting through the box of hospital mementos, he found a folded drawing, a picture Lily had made on one of her visits. It showed a tall tower touching the sky, and on top of it stood two stick figures holding hands, one taller, one smaller, surrounded by clouds. Underneath, in her uneven handwriting, she had written, "The Promise Tower, where brave people meet again." The paper was smudged from being folded so often, but the words glowed like fire in his mind. That night, Ethan stayed awake until dawn sketching plans. By morning, he knew what he wanted to build. When he told his father about it, Victor stared at him in disbelief. "A rehabilitation center?" he repeated. "You want to build another hospital?" "Not a hospital," Ethan said calmly. "A place for healing, for children who don't just need medicine but hope." Victor rubbed his temples. "Do you realize how much that will cost? You could just donate to existing charities." Ethan met his father's eyes with quiet firmness. "I'm not donating. I'm building. It's not for publicity, it's for her." Victor frowned. "Her, a little girl who taught me to stand again," Ethan replied softly. "She deserves a tower in the sky." The argument went on for days. Victor thought it was a sentimental whim. Ethan thought it was destiny. In the end, when Victor realized his son would do it with or without his help, he gave in, not out of understanding but respect. Fine, he said. If this is what you want, do it properly. We'll fund it, but it must be sustainable. Ethan nodded. Then we'll make it sustainable with hearts, not just money. And so, the Lily Heart Rehabilitation Center was born, designed to look nothing like a hospital. Glass walls opened to gardens. Hallways were lined with murals painted by children. Instead of sterile silence, music played softly through the speakers. The motto written above the entrance was simple: "Every cloud counts." On opening day, people came from all over the state. Families of sick children, doctors, donors, and even some of Ethan's old hospital friends gathered in the courtyard. Reporters stood at the edge, eager for sound bites, but Ethan didn't care. He stood on the stage, taller now, his posture confident but humble. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "This place is not about my recovery," he began. "It's about a little girl who taught me that strength isn't about muscles. It's about how big your heart stays when life tries to break it. She believed clouds could hear our wishes, so we built a place where those wishes can grow." There were tears in the audience, even from hardened reporters used to covering tragedy. Victor Raymond watched from the front row, his eyes glistening with something he hadn't felt in years: pride, not in wealth or power, but in humanity. As months turned into years, the center flourished. Children who had lost faith in recovery found hope again. Parents who came in despair left with gratitude. Ethan worked tirelessly, meeting every child personally, sitting beside their hospital beds, listening to their fears the way he once had listened to Lily. The staff loved him for his compassion, and the world began to see him not as a billionaire's son, but as a man with purpose. Yet he never let fame touch his heart. Whenever someone praised him, he would smile and point toward the sky, saying, "The credit belongs up there." One rainy afternoon, a new patient arrived, a small boy with brittle bones, his face pale and eyes full of quiet anger. He refused to talk to anyone. He broke his toys and screamed at the nurses. Ethan recognized that pain. He saw his own reflection in that child's rebellion. So he wheeled himself. Though he could walk now, he sometimes used the chair to remind himself of where he came from, into the boy's room. "You don't have to talk," Ethan said gently. "But I can listen." The boy glared at him, muttering, "You wouldn't understand." Ethan smiled softly. "Try me." For a long time, silence filled the room. Then slowly the boy began to speak, about fear, about pain, about being different. Ethan listened, really listened, without interruption. And when the boy finished, he asked, "Do you like clouds?" The boy frowned. "Clouds? They're always changing," Ethan said. "Never stuck in one shape. Maybe we can be like them." The boy looked out the window, then nodded slightly. That was the beginning of another story, one born from the legacy of a little girl's kindness. As the years passed, the Lily Heart Center became more than a building. It became a movement. Branches opened in other cities, all carrying the same message: healing begins with listening. Ethan's name appeared on awards, charity boards, and humanitarian lists, but he always stayed the same humble man who still counted clouds. On anniversaries, he would visit Crestview Hospital, standing quietly by the old window where it had all begun. Sometimes he brought flowers. Sometimes he just stood there, feeling the morning sun warm his face. The nurses still remembered the boy who never smiled and the little girl who made him laugh again. The staff kept a framed picture of Lily's drawing on the wall, faded but priceless. One morning, as Ethan looked out that window again, a small breeze swept through the corridor. The curtains lifted slightly, and for a moment the sunlight broke through a cloud and fell directly on the spot where Lily used to sit. Ethan closed his eyes and smiled. In the soft rustle of the leaves outside, he heard her voice as clear as the day she first spoke to him. "They shouldn't laugh. My mom says laughing at someone's pain makes your heart smaller," he whispered back. "You made mine bigger." He turned toward the doorway where a group of children in wheelchairs waited for their therapy session. He walked to them slowly, his step steady and sure. "Ready to count clouds?" he asked. They nodded, their faces bright. Together they moved to the window, pointing and laughing, their reflections merging in the glass. And somewhere high above, among the drifting white shapes, a small cloud seemed to take the shape of a rabbit holding a crown, as if the sky itself remembered the promise. When the sky was questioned by the third year of the Lily Hart Rehabilitation Center, the glass hallways were filled with children's art that seemed to move when the sunlight traveled across the walls, and the gardens had grown into a living maze of lavender and rosemary where parents walked to breathe out fear and breathe in courage. Ethan kept his promise to remain close to the ground and close to the sky at the same time. He spent mornings in the therapy rooms counting quiet victories and afternoons in the office, signing dull papers to protect the bright work. He had learned that the world applauds miracles but runs on maintenance, and he accepted the unglamorous discipline of maintenance because he remembered a little girl who had been brave without an audience. Yet the larger the center became, the more the outside world pressed its face against the window and decided it understood what went on inside. Comments began to travel with strange speed in places Ethan did not visit. Suggestions that a wealthy young man had built a beautiful stage for himself, that the children were props, that the clouds he counted were carefully arranged lights for the cameras. He tried to ignore the noise because the work was louder, but noise, once it finds a crack, grows teeth. The crack arrived in the shape of a partnership proposal that seemed generous at first glance and hollow at second. A celebrity wellness brand, glossy, smiling, perfectly packaged, offered sponsored equipment and national ads featuring Ethan's story. Their team came with smooth words and neat presentations showing graphs that rose like rockets. They promised more donations, more reach, more awareness. Victor, who now supported his son with a respect that had matured into quiet admiration, suggested caution but left the decision to Ethan. The board leaned toward yes, because boards often prefer clean numbers over messy integrity. Ethan took the proposal home and placed it beside Lily's drawing, the one with the tower and the two stick figures. He studied both long into the night. One set of lines said scale. The other said soul. He chose soul, and he wrote a gentle refusal that began with gratitude and ended with the sentence, "We do not put logos on children's courage." The brand accepted politely in public, and it seemed not so politely in private because only a few weeks later, a video appeared online that would test the center's foundations. It was recorded in a hallway at Crestview Hospital on a rainy afternoon when Ethan had returned to visit old nurses and deliver a quiet donation to the emergency fund. The camera caught him pausing beside a door, leaning back against the wall, rubbing his leg with a face tight from pain. Recovery had given him movement, but not immunity. Rainy days still sent electrical storms through his nerves. The clip cut away from that moment and then cut back as two 20-something content creators, popular for their harsh humor, stepped into frame. They whispered the kind of whisper that is meant to be heard. "Must be nice to pretend you're hurting when the red light is on." They chuckled. Billionaire rehab cosplay. The video edited in a montage of Ethan speaking at past events, trimmed to look self-congratulatory, and overlaid snide voiceovers about halo marketing. It ended with a freeze frame of his face in the hallway, eyes closed against a spasm, with a caption that read, "Tears for the brand." The clip spread fast because cruelty rides the fastest horses. People who had never walked the center's corridors decided the story after 10 seconds of footage. Sponsors called with nervous voices. The board called with urgent ones. Nurses texted kind words that could not travel far enough through the noise. Ethan felt that old corridor of silence open inside him, the one he had learned to fill with service. And for one long evening he locked his office door and sat with the weight. He did not answer the calls. Not because he had no answer, but because answers delivered in anger are tools that break in your hand. He visited the therapy room instead and stayed until the last child went to dinner. As he turned out the lights, a soft voice came from the doorway and asked if the stars could be seen on a rainy night. The voice belonged to Maya, a 9-year-old who had arrived 2 months earlier with a spinal condition that demanded braces and patience in equal parts. She was small, with dark eyes that noticed everything without flinching, and she walked with careful steps as if each movement were a secret lesson. Ethan said you cannot see stars when clouds are thick, but you can trust they are there because night is never empty. Maya nodded like someone who recognized that kind of faith. She had a habit of asking precise questions: where pain hides, why some muscles forget, how long a no can be before a yes returns. That night she asked one more. Why were people outside saying unkind things about a person who helped her learn to tie her brace without crying? The question was not a request for gossip. It was a child asking how to live in a world where good work is doubted. Ethan told her the truth in simple words. He said there are days when clouds throw shadows on the ground, and some people believe the ground created the shadow. He said he could not control their belief, but could continue to make light. Then Maya did something he did not expect. She reached into the pocket of her hoodie and pulled out a small digital recorder, the cheap kind sold at corner shops, and set it on the therapy table like a piece of evidence. I brought this to remember the exercises, she explained, because memory is slippery when the pain gets loud. She pressed play. A quiet room filled with familiar sounds. Ethan's patient voice guiding her through breathing, counting steady and kind, praising every inch of gained balance, laughing the soft laugh he saved for fragile victories. There was nothing dramatic, nothing performative, just work done with care when no one was watching. She stopped the recording and said, almost apologetically, I thought this might be proof for me on bad days, but maybe the world has bad days too. The next morning, without publicists or a plan, the center invited families to an open afternoon called Listen Hour. No speeches, no media, no branded backdrops. A whiteboard stood in the atrium with a question written in plain markers. What helped you the most when you hurt? Parents and children arrived with shy faces that turned brave when they saw other shy faces. Nurses brought tea. The board members, half curious and half anxious, mingled near the back. Ethan opened the doors and then stepped away from the center of the room and sat beside the therapy mats with the children, because he had no interest in staging a defense. He wanted to make a room where truth could walk in without makeup. People began to speak. A mother talked about the night her son stopped hiding his brace because a young man in a gray hoodie had shown him the scar paths on his own legs and said scars are just maps that prove you traveled. A father described how at 2 in the morning, when monitors screamed like frightened birds, a volunteer with a familiar quiet voice sat by their daughter and told cloud stories until the machines remembered their jobs. A teenager admitted he had planned to run away from treatment until someone taught him to count to 3 slowly and mean it. No cameras recorded these confessions. Only the whiteboard caught the words in childlike handwriting. Someone listened, someone waited, someone counted with me. As the hour wound down, the hospital chaplain, who rarely spoke at public gatherings, raised a hand and said the only sentence he had prepared. If a camera had been in the room every time kindness saved a person from giving up, we would not have enough screens in the city to play the footage. He sat, and the room breathed the kind of breath that happens after a truth lands exactly where it belongs. Then Maya stood, brace gleaming under her leggings like a thin suit of armor, and asked if she could borrow the whiteboard marker. She did not make a speech. She drew a small cloud and beneath it wrote, "He teaches us even when his leg hurts." She looked at Ethan and added, "Even when people laugh." With the unself-conscious gravity that belongs only to children, she pulled her little recorder from her hoodie and pressed play so the atrium could hear the voice that had guided her around the edges of fear. The sound washed through the room. It was plain. It was ordinary. It was the truth. Someone near the back began to cry, the quiet cry of relief when a story returns to its correct owner. The board members stopped glancing at their phones. A nurse whispered, "Lily would like this," and another nurse squeezed her hand. The clip that had tried to stain a reputation kept circulating for a while, as such things do when anger feeds them. But an odd thing happened that the brand strategists had not predicted. The open afternoon, which no one recorded, traveled farther than the edited video. Not in pixels, but in people. Families called other families. Therapists from other cities asked to visit and learn how to write simplicity on whiteboards without losing seriousness. A school counselor who had never heard of the center before sent a letter that said, "If your work is a tower, it is built from listening." And while the metrics department could not chart the exact root of this human rumor, they noticed a slow rise in the only number that mattered: children who completed programs because they felt believed. Still, the world being what it is, the story required a day of public reckoning, and it arrived when Crestview Hospital hosted its annual fundraiser. The organizers asked Ethan to attend because his presence, whether he liked it or not, opened hesitant wallets. He agreed on the condition that the evening focus on patient needs, not personalities. The same content creators who had made the mocking video were there as guests of a sponsor, leaning over a bar of cold crystal and warm lights, practicing the tight smile of people who have come to collect scenes. Midway through the evening, a slideshow of patient art began to roll across a high screen. Without warning, one of the creators shouted a comment that landed like a dropped tray. "Cue the billionaire tears." Laughter skittered at the edges of the room, the kind of nervous laughter that fears choosing a side. The host reached for the microphone. Victor, who had aged gently into a man whose pride no longer wore hard shoes, stiffened at the table. Ethan rose not to answer, but to walk somewhere quiet until the moment passed. He was halfway to the hallway when a small figure in silver sneakers cut across the carpet with the purposeful gait of someone who had practiced balance as an art. Maya climbed the 3 low steps to the stage without asking permission and took the microphone with the simple authority of a child claiming her own story. She said she had not planned to speak because she preferred finishing tasks to starting speeches. But she had learned something about laughter. Sometimes it is medicine, and sometimes it is a knife, and the difference is whether it is shared or aimed. She said one rainy afternoon a man had taught her how to breathe through a spasm by counting to 3 in a voice that stayed calm even when his face did not. She said she had a little machine that captured his voice because on bad days, her brain forgot he had said she could be brave, and the machine reminded her like a friend knocking on a door. She held up the recorder so the lights caught the cheap plastic and said it was not a brand, it was a bridge. Then she told a piece of truth no one in that ballroom had heard. The afternoon the mocking video was filmed, Ethan had been standing outside the room of a child whose parents were signing the form to end aggressive treatment after months of fighting. He had leaned against the wall because sorrow has weight, and the body respects physics even when the heart would like to ignore it. He had gone in and sat with the family for 2 hours, saying very little, because sometimes the kindest sentence is a quiet chair. "If you want a video," she said, not unkindly, not angrily, just clean, "then show that room. But we did not bring a camera. We brought hands." Silence fell with a softness that smothered every wrong sound. The sponsor's table shifted as if chairs had become suddenly uncomfortable for those who had invited noise dressed as influence. The content creators stared at their drink rims, where the lights made little crowns that did not fit. The host, who had been brave enough to plan a fundraiser in a world tired of asking for help, found her voice again and said thank you in a tone people use at funerals and weddings, where truth is the guest of honor. Ethan did not walk back to the stage. He found a spot by the side door and looked up, and although the ceiling was a chandelier ocean, he imagined clouds moving beyond the roof, and he felt the old prayer form without words. Protect softness. Strengthen the quiet. Keep me small where smallness is holy. The next morning he wrote a letter, not to the internet, not to the brand, not to the men who had used a lens as a blade, but to the children of the center. He told them clouds are not proof of the sky, they are the sky showing its work. He told them that on some days people will question their steps because the steps are small, and on other days they will question their rest because the rest is long, and none of those questions change the truth that courage is patient. He promised them that Listen Hour would not be a one-time event but a weekly practice. He asked the staff to set aside a whiteboard, a kettle, and the time it takes to finish a simple cup of tea. Because programs heal bodies, but rooms of listening help humans stay healed. The board, having stood in the atrium and watched doubt dissolve in front of a child's drawing, voted to fund the practice without debate. Victor wrote a check larger than the first seed grant and, in a margin note only his son would read, scribbled, "For maintenance, the bravest work." News cycles moved on as they always do after they have chewed a story until no flavor remains. But something quieter and better stayed. Families who had believed the quick lie encountered the slower truth and apologized in emails that began with embarrassment and ended with grateful details about progress at home. The celebrity brand sent a second proposal, better in tone but still incorrect in spirit. Ethan wrote back with the same sentence, no logos on courage, and added a kind postscript suggesting they start a scholarship with no cameras present. Whether they ever did, he never checked, because his horizon had narrowed again to the size of a therapy room where a girl in silver sneakers practiced standing without holding the parallel bars and asked if he thought the sky ever got tired of carrying clouds. He said maybe the sky learned from the clouds how to keep moving, and maybe people learned from the sky. On the anniversary of Lily's passing, Ethan returned to the old window at Crestview before dawn. Rain had washed the city through the night, and the glass wore a veil of tiny rivers. He stood without leaning. The janitor, pushing his quiet broom, paused and nodded the respectful nod of a man who has watched more transformations than any journalist will ever record. Ethan placed a single paper crown on the sill, the kind children cut from construction paper, and beside it, a small plastic recorder wrapped with a ribbon. He did not press play. He did not need to hear the voice because he had become the voice for others. He whispered that the Promise Tower was no longer a drawing but a practice, built every time a room chose kindness over spectacle. He thanked the sky for staying even when hidden. He thanked the clouds for moving even when doubted. And when he turned to leave, a child's giggle echoed down the corridor from the pediatric wing, a new laugh with the old brightness inside it. And he smiled in the way that had once felt impossible, the way that now opened doors. The lesson of the unreachable. Sky autumn came softly that year, wrapping the hills around the Lily Heart Center in fog that smelled faintly of rain and pine. Inside, heaters whispered and children wore new sweaters sent by volunteers whose names they would never know. Ethan moved more slowly now, not because his body was failing again, but because the work had reached that weight where every decision affected real hearts. He had learned to pace himself, yet the universe, as always, waited for the moment when a man began to think he understood balance before it tested his footing. The test arrived through a family from 2 states away. Their daughter, Isabel, was 12, a violin prodigy before the car crash that left her spine twisted and her lungs fragile. Her parents had spent a fortune on treatment, and every operation had promised more than it delivered. When they entered the center's bright atrium, Isabel's mother clutched the violin case as if it still contained breath. Ethan met them with his usual calm smile and promised that here they would never be measured by progress charts alone. For the first few weeks, the routine seemed to work. Isabel painted, attended therapy, and even taught other children how to hold a bow. But the truth of her injuries was deeper than medicine could reach, and soon the doctors began to speak in the careful tone reserved for parents who already know what is coming. Her lungs were failing. She would not see another spring. When Ethan heard the prognosis, the old ache in his legs flared, as if the nerves remembered every loss. He tried to hide it behind management duties, reviewing budgets, walking the corridors, pretending that hope was an administrative skill. At night, he sat in the courtyard under the dim lamps and stared at the high windows of the pediatric wing where Isabel's light burned late. He wanted to believe there was still something he could do, a new therapy, a specialist, a miracle. But this was the one mountain money, will, and faith could not move. The same helplessness that had once broken him now returned as a mirror. He could only listen. One evening, he found Isabel sitting by the practice room window, bow resting on her knees, breathing through the thin oxygen tube. She asked him a question that landed like truth disguised as curiosity. Why do adults look away when children get close to dying? Ethan thought for a long time before answering. Because we were taught that bravery means fixing things. But sometimes bravery means staying when there's nothing left to fix. She nodded, and without another word began to play. Slow, imperfect, beautiful. The melody filled the hallway and drifted into other rooms where nurses paused, where parents closed their eyes. He realized she was teaching him the very lesson he had once taught others, that presence can be louder than cure. She died 2 weeks later, just before dawn. The staff knew before the monitors stopped because the building itself seemed to sigh. Ethan walked the corridor barefoot, feeling the cold tile, grounding himself in the ordinary to survive the extraordinary. When he reached her room, the violin case was open on the bed. Inside was a folded note. Don't build another tower, Mr. Cloud Counter. Teach them to play what they have left. He read it 3 times before the meaning settled. It was not another project she wanted, but another perspective. Healing was not always construction. Sometimes it was composition. Grief came like tide, slow, relentless, reshaping everything it touched. For the first time since the center's founding, Ethan canceled public appearances and spent weeks in near silence. He joined therapy sessions only to sit quietly in the back, observing without directing. It was during one of those muted afternoons that an unexpected visitor arrived. A woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a pendant shaped like a rabbit. She introduced herself as Clara Hart, Lily's mother. She had avoided the center for years, afraid the walls would reopen wounds. But after seeing news of Isabel's passing, she felt pulled, here to bring something full circle. From her bag, she took a thin folder of letters Lily had written during her hospital months. Letters addressed not to Ethan, but to whoever forgets why kindness matters. They were small notes of advice, written in childish script. Be gentle first. Believe second. Fix third. Clara placed them on the table and said, She wrote these for strangers. Maybe they belong to you now. Reading them was like finding blueprints for everything he had built without realizing he was following instructions. He and Clara sat for hours in the quiet cafe of the center, talking about Lily's laugh, about guilt that never fully fades, about the strange arithmetic of loss that multiplies purpose. By the end of their conversation, a new idea had taken shape, not a monument this time, but a curriculum. Together, they planned the Heart Program, a training course for caregivers and volunteers that focused less on procedures and more on presence, teaching how to listen, how to sit in silence, how to be brave enough not to promise false hope. It would use Isabel's music as its theme and Lily's letters as its text. Clara agreed to lead the first sessions herself. Let them know the mother's side of miracles, she said. The launch of the program changed the rhythm of the center. Nurses attended workshops after shifts. Parents joined weekend groups. Even Victor Raymond, who had once measured success in balance sheets, came to one session and stayed the entire day. The philosophy was simple. Healing is a duet. One day, during a training exercise, Ethan asked the participants to describe what courage looked like now. A young nurse replied, Courage looks like staying in a room after the miracle doesn't happen. Another added, and opening the window anyway. He realized then that Isabel and Lily had not been separate lessons. They were chapters of the same book, each teaching him that love must evolve or it calcifies. By winter, the fog lifted, revealing a clear line of mountains dusted with snow. The children who could walk were taken outside to see the peaks, and those who couldn't were wheeled to the big windows. Ethan stood among them, hands in his coat pockets, heart quiet. He looked up, and the clouds were moving slowly again, scattered like pages across the blue. He whispered, For you, Lily. For you, Isabel. Behind him, Clara's voice carried softly through the cold air. They're proud, you know. He turned and saw her smiling faintly, eyes on the sky. For the first time since Isabel's passing, he felt warmth that did not hurt. That evening he wrote in his journal, a habit he rarely shared with anyone, the sky is unreachable not to mock us, but to keep us climbing inside. Some days we count clouds. Some days we count losses. Both are numbers of life. And when the lights in the center dimmed, and the children's laughter melted into the hum of night machines, Ethan walked the corridors once more, checking every room as if guarding not just bodies but stories. At the end of the hallway, he paused, listening to the wind tapping against the glass, and thought he heard 3 soft beats, as if someone, somewhere, was still counting with him. Would you like me to continue with part 5, the final, long emotional conclusion where Ethan passes the legacy forward, showing the center's expansion across the world, the reunion between generations of healed children, and the final poetic closing that unites all the story's lessons? The legacy of the clouds years later, the mountains around the Lily Hart Rehabilitation Center no longer wore the shy green of youth, but the deep, confident shade of forests that had learned to outlast storms. The center itself had grown beyond glass and gardens. It had become a constellation of light across the world. Branches opened quietly in other cities, not through press releases but through whispers. Families who had once been healed became healers. Nurses trained under the Heart program taught new nurses, and children who had learned to count clouds now taught others to breathe through pain. And at the center of it all, still walking the same slow, deliberate steps that reminded him of every inch he had earned, was Ethan Raymond, older now, silver streaking the hair above his temples, his body strong but softened by humility. He no longer liked the title founder. He preferred what the staff called him affectionately, the listener-in-chief. His office door stayed open, and people came not for orders but for conversation. Sometimes a young therapist asked him how to handle exhaustion. Sometimes a parent just needed to cry where no one would write a report about it. Ethan always answered the same way, by staying, by listening, by making the silence feel safe. The philosophy had never changed. Healing begins where someone chooses not to look away. On a spring morning, heavy with the scent of new rain, he stood by the window of the original building and watched the children plant small white flags in the garden. Each flag carried a name written in colorful marker, not names of loss, but names of gratitude. It was an annual ritual now, called the Sky Day, where every patient, former or current, wrote the name of someone who had helped them keep going. Flags fluttered like tiny clouds anchored to the earth. Ethan's own flag carried 2 names, Lily and Isabel. He pressed it gently into the soil, the way you would tuck a blanket around a sleeping child. As the ceremony ended, a nurse approached with an envelope marked private. It was thick, old-fashioned, sealed with blue wax. Inside was a letter written in neat cursive. The signature at the bottom made his hands tremble. Victor Raymond. His father had passed quietly the week before, leaving behind not an empire of money but a letter that felt more valuable than all his buildings combined. My son, I used to think strength was control and wealth was certainty. I spent my life building walls that could not fall and forgot that people need windows more. I have watched you build windows. You turned the accident that broke our world into a bridge for others. I never told you enough, but I have learned more from your silence than I ever learned from my own success. The last investment I make is not in steel or glass, but in belief. Belief that you will keep teaching the world that compassion can be inherited if we choose to pass it down. If heaven has clouds, tell Lily thank you for lending me a better son. He read it 3 times, folded it carefully, and slipped it into the small wooden box on his desk where he kept Lily's crown and Isabel's note. 3 lives, 3 lessons, bound by one truth. Kindness does not die. It changes form. That summer brought a new chapter. A documentary team from a small educational network asked permission to film the Heart program for medical universities. Ethan hesitated, remembering old wounds with cameras, but Clara Hart convinced him. "This isn't fame," she said. "It's preservation. When we're gone, let them still hear what we heard." And so, for the first time in years, he agreed. The filming lasted weeks, quiet, respectful, capturing moments of real care. A nurse tying a brace, a father and son laughing during hydrotherapy, a volunteer teaching a child to paint clouds. They even filmed Ethan's evening walks, where he checked the lights in each ward one by one. The final scene was not scripted. The filmmakers followed him to the rooftop garden where the view stretched beyond the valley. He stood there at dusk, the sky washed in gold and violet, and said softly, "People think the sky is up there, but it's also in here." He placed his hand over his chest. "Every time we lift someone, we build another piece of it." The documentary aired late one night on public television, and though it never went viral, it reached exactly who it needed to: medical students, small-town caregivers, nurses who worked unpaid hours because love was louder than exhaustion. Letters began to arrive from around the world. Handwritten notes, children's drawings, emails from strangers who said, "I watched your story when I thought I couldn't keep doing this work, and it reminded me why I began." Ethan read every one and saved them in digital folders labeled Proof of Clouds. One afternoon, while he was reviewing those messages, the receptionist announced a visitor. A young woman stepped into his office, tall and confident, with the unmistakable calm of someone who had known hospitals since childhood. "Mr. Raymond," she said, smiling, "you probably don't remember me. My name is Maya." He blinked. The name hit like sunlight through memory. She was no longer the little girl with silver braces and a cheap recorder. She was now in her early 20s, studying pediatric physiotherapy at the local university, interning at the center she once called home. She placed something gently on his desk, a small, battered digital recorder wrapped with a ribbon. "It still works," she said, pressing play. The speaker crackled, then released a familiar sound, his own younger voice, counting, calm and steady. 1, 2, 3. "You're doing great, Maya." He looked up at her, eyes shining. "You kept it." "I kept it," she said, "because sometimes the world gets loud again, and I need to remember the quiet." He laughed softly, the kind of laugh that carried both joy and humility. "Then maybe you're ready to teach the next generation to count clouds." Maya nodded. "That's why I'm here. I want to start a children's leadership group. Not about recovery, but about hope." Lily started it without knowing. Isabel continued it. "You built the bridge. Now we'll walk others across it." For a long moment, neither spoke. They just stood there, two survivors of time, one passing the torch without ceremony, the other receiving it with gratitude. Ethan finally said, "Then the Promise Tower is complete. It reaches higher than buildings. It reaches through people." Over the next year, Maya's group, the Cloud Counters, became a cornerstone of the center's mission. Former patients returned to mentor current ones, teaching through stories rather than lectures. They organized letter exchanges between centers in different countries, sharing drawings, poems, and simple words of encouragement. One letter came from a small island clinic that had painted "Every Cloud Counts" in bright blue above its door. Ethan hung the photo on the wall of his office, right beside Lily's original drawing. The tower she had imagined was no longer paper. It stretched across continents, invisible but unbreakable. Time, patient and impartial, continued its work. Ethan's steps slowed further. His hair turned white, and he began spending more time in the rooftop garden, where the staff built a small bench in his honor. From there, he could see the valley, the children playing, and the clouds drifting lazily overhead. When visitors came, he would gesture at the sky and tell them stories, not about himself, but about the people who had taught him to live twice. "Lily showed me the beginning of courage," he would say. "Isabel showed me the end of fear. The rest is just walking between them." One twilight, when the sky turned copper and the air smelled faintly of lavender, Ethan closed the center's journal after writing its final entry. "If one life listens, the echo never ends." He leaned back on the bench, feeling the cool metal beneath his hands, and watched the clouds gather into shapes that seemed almost familiar. A small girl with a paper crown, a violin resting against her shoulder, and beyond them countless others drifting together into light. The wind brushed his face, warm and gentle, as if whispering a thank you that belonged to every voice he had ever heard. When the staff found him later, he was still sitting there peacefully, eyes open toward the sky, a faint smile on his lips. There was no sadness in the air, only stillness, the kind that carries completion. On his lap lay an envelope addressed simply to the next listener. Inside were 4 words written in Ethan's steady hand. Keep counting. Keep believing. The next morning, the children gathered in the courtyard, each holding a white flag. Maya stood before them and raised her eyes to the clouds. "He's still counting," she said softly. Together, they planted the flags one by one until the garden shimmered like a field of tiny heavens. And somewhere above, beyond sight but not beyond feeling, the clouds drifted gently, carrying laughter, courage, and the everlasting echo of every heart that had ever dared to listen. End of story.